All right. We are.
This is a wonderful long pause. All right.
I heard
Yeah, hey, all right. Bruce is coming back. Now we can start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final Visiting Writer Series event of the semester. We're thrilled to have Raul Palma here to share his fiction with us. And I'm Dan Rosenberg. I usually run the Visiting Writer Series, but James Miranda, my colleague, is going to be introducing Raul tonight. So I'm only up here to say hi and welcome, and to thank NYSCA, the New York State Council for the Arts, whose generous funding has allowed us to bring writers like Raul to campus. And they are supporting not just the Visiting Writer Series, but the entire Visiting Artist program at Wells, which includes visual artists, people who work in the theater. It's really a broad, campus-wide support of the public-facing art program that we have here. And so it's been really nice to feel like we have this support and this just capacity to have events like this. So thank you, NYSCA. I'm gonna do that right at the camera. And yeah, I think Raul, I'm really excited for these, this story in particular, which you promised was the most profane. Is it the most profane? I'm thrilled for it, but the way we're going to work it tonight is James will introduce Raul. Raul will read for a bit. We'll have an opportunity at the end of the story to have Q&A, discussion, and then seeing where we are on time, maybe there'll be an excerpt of another story that Raul will share with us, but we'll just see where we go. Seem good? All right, let's kick it off. Please come on up and introduce Raul. James Miranda. Yeah. Yay, James!
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Is this, yeah. Hello, YouTube. It is my honor to introduce Raul Palma tonight as our last writer in the Visiting Writer Series, our capstone writer, some might say. Raul comes to us from Ithaca and Ithaca College, where he's currently the Associate Dean of Humanities and Sciences and a member of the writing faculty. And now, I know Raul personally. I love him and his family. So it is tough for me to parcel out like small professional doses of information in the language of introductees and separate that from you as a writer. But as I was thinking about that, I was thinking one of the reasons I'm having that problem is that it's really difficult to separate you, the writer, from your own personality. and in the best possible way. And it's not necessarily because you write autobiographically, which you do and you don't, or because his characters closely resemble you, but it is more like the spirit of Raul, his Raulness, if you will, that infuses his writing. And it has nothing to do with identity, kind of in the two-dimensional sense of the term, but rather with something I can only call soul or elan or animus, all of the indescribable vitality that makes a charismatic person an indescribably charismatic person. In his fiction, Raul may capture the city of Miami, a slice of the Cuban American experience, the evolving American tale of assimilation and marginalization and adaptation, etc. But he also just captures what it means to be alive in a city and a state and a country and a world that is bright and beautiful and bewitching and also cruel and vindictive and absurd. He is able to capture perfectly his own sense of humor, which is one of the things that I love about his writing. And at turns that humor is dark and wry and deliciously sardonic. And he also captures perfectly his own heart, which is expansive and encompassing and seeking and generative. He captures, as the writer Janine Capo-Cruzet has said, a place worth mourning and celebrating, and as the writer Joy Castro has said, the soft, weird underbelly of psyches as brutal and exquisite as real life. And Raul is the author of the just recently out, for the most part, collection of short fiction in this world of ultraviolet light, which I believe he's reading from tonight, which was the winner of the 2021 Don Belton Prize from Indiana University Press. And in October of this fall, which I'm very excited about, the forthcoming novel, A Haunting in Hialeah Gardens from Dutton. His work has also appeared in the Alaska Quarterly Review, the Chattahoochee Review, the Greensboro Review, Hayden's Ferry Review, Smokelong Quarterly, and the Sonora Review. And it has been supported with fellowships and scholarships from the Cuba One Foundation, the Kimmel Harding Nelson Center, the Santa Fe Writers Conference, Suwannee Writers Conference, and the Sundress Academy for the Arts. So please join me in welcoming Raul Palma.
Hey, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. And I said this earlier, but thank you also on a beautiful day like this for being here indoors. Right? It means a lot. I'm going to jump right into it. I'm going to read a story called Stand Your Ground. It's about 12 pages, 13 pages. So you know what you're getting into. And then I'll pause for a moment. We can have a conversation. And then after that, if there's time, if it makes sense, I'll read something else. So stand your ground. After my shift, Rafa would scoop me up, and then we'd go vandalize people's homes. Every night, it seemed like we were rolling through the city of Miami, P.D. Pablo blasting, a couple of spiked cherry Slurpees in our hands. We'd take turns leaning out the passenger window, swinging baseball bats or mailboxes, knocking them clean off. Or we'd dash onto strangers' lawns in places with names like the Gables or Cocoa Plum, knocking over fountains and peeling out. We were addicted to breaking things. In a time when it seemed like anything could break, we were intent on making sure. We liked toppling the fountains the best. They were the stupidest ornaments. But this kind of vandalism had its risks. It took quite some strength to get under so much stone and water and lift. If you weren't careful, you could trip on all the wires and lights, or worse, parts of the fountain could cascade on you. And then you'd have to get the rubble off before escaping. This happened to Rafa once. A big old 5-tier toppled right on him. I had to get out of the car and help the motherfucker, and lucky for us, the owners didn't hear the commotion. They didn't reach for their gun and meet us on the lawn, stand your ground style, or maybe I wouldn't be here telling this story. This was Miami, in or around the months following the September 11th attacks. All of the city was covered in those $2 Home Depot American flags. And I don't know why, but something about seeing those colors draped over the city made me and Rafa want to rip out every last one of them. Maybe that's how all this vandalizing started, with me and Rafa driving around, collecting flags, collecting so many that in a week we filled 4 garbage bags worth. And when we didn't have space for so much patriotism, we drove to the Everglades, set them atop cardboard, and burned them all, and watched as the wind carried them, still burning, into the dry grass across the Miami Trail. We were students at Florida International University, first years. I was circling the drain around the business school. Rafa wasn't even attending classes. We'd sat next to each other during orientation, and poor guy, some righteous acting advisor, took to the stage to patronize all of us. Wake up, kids, you're in college now. You gotta have a plan to succeed. Dude was up there shouting out these cliches, trying to rouse the masses, when out of the blue, he pointed to Rafa and asked, "How about you?" Rafa, who was maybe the only darker guy in the crowd, was not having it. The man asked, "What's your major?" He even jumped off the stage to thrust the mic in Rafa's face. And what did my childhood friend say, still yawning and rubbing his eyes from the boredom? "Guy, I don't know." Well, that must have been the answer that unmotivational speaker had been hoping for, because the dude fixed his bow tie and said, "You don't know, your major, what a way to start college." He hit the mark though. Neither of us were off to a good start. I was still clocking in 30+ hours at Walgreens, at the threshold of full-time work, trying to do my part to help my mom. I had no time to study. Plus, it was so hard to take college seriously. In one lab, we spent the first 2 weeks measuring the distance between the anus and the mouth of various mollusks. It seemed like one giant joke. In lectures, I could hardly stay focused, and I was certain that I would flunk out by the end of the year. And Rafa, he was doing just as bad. In some Latin American history course, he was learning about castes and colonialism and how sexual violence gave rise to the economics of legitimacy. And rather than feeling empowered with that knowledge, he was coming unstitched. In his creative writing course, when asked to describe something tangible in the room, he'd chosen his own hand. Its color, a café con leche, he'd written. And just thinking of the sugar drove his imagination to the Cuban countryside, the plantations, the hand of his ancestors ragged from the machete handle, and the culling of sugarcane. Rafa had said that merely reading the poem aloud made his eyes watery, and he laughed about it, about being a dude on the brink of tears. But then his demeanor changed when he described the professor's feedback. Nice, imaginative, but the assignment was to focus on something tangible in the room. Was I not sitting right there, Rafa asked, in front of him? He probably meant something physical, you know. What, so you agree with him? Aye, Rafa, I told him. You can take things so personally. Oh yeah, he said, and he told me what happened next. Some dude shared a poem dedicated to a female student in the class. My thought, that's kind of cool. I'd never thought of using poetry for anything like that. And I joked that maybe I should start writing poetry too, but Rafa was angry. And I don't know why. Maybe I was distracted or bored, but he was getting all worked up over lines from this dude's poem, firm as mangoes and bruised and sunburst and begging for a bite. I didn't mind the imagery, to be honest, and I told Rafa as much. And at this, while walking through campus, right in front of everyone, he said, "Fuck you." What? Why? Because you don't even know how ignorant you are, he said, with such authority. I like mangoes. The woman walked out of the class. He was writing about her body, idiot. Harsh. Something was changing in him. We'd be watching television or something like we'd done a gazillion times, and J-Lo would come on in some performance, and I'd say, "Look at that ass." And Rafa would smack me really hard. "Dude, you gotta really be like that?" I guess he thought I was objectifying her. I'd only said it because we'd always said that shit when J-Lo came on. It didn't take long to feel like we were on the outs with one another. The school year had barely gotten rolling, and he'd started hanging out with new people, the kind of people who'd stand outside fraternities in the heat with signs like "Real men take no" for an answer. And "my dress does not mean yes." I made fun of him for that. And he didn't appreciate the jokes. More so, from what I could tell, he'd stopped going to class entirely. Every night I'd be like, "Yo, Rafa, we gotta make some time to hit the books. You know, it's been a while." I missed him, if I'm being totally honest. I'd grown up with the guy my whole life, but he had no interest in studying, and the things he said scared me. One time, he came right out and responded, "What for? What can college even really offer me?" Then after a long pause, he said, "You know what I miss? Driving around and fucking things up." So that's what we did every night. By the time the Twin Towers fell on September 11th, neither me nor Rafa were particularly shook. If I'm being totally honest, it was such a huge fucking relief that the world could end. My parents were at work already, Rafa was over, and we were having leftover Taco Bell for breakfast, watching the buildings fall to a tribe called Quest Can I Kick It. Even if my manager hadn't called to say the store was closed, I wouldn't have shown up. I wouldn't have shown up to class either. After breakfast, Rafa and I drove to the beach. We walked the shore and smoked, and he asked, "Can we do what we want now? Do we have permission?" It seemed that way. It seemed like the tragedy had cleaved a hole in Miami large enough for us to hide in. It was the first time that I looked at Miami, its skyline, and thought, would it be so bad if the planes had actually hit here? Down the street, there was this Muslim kid named Sohail, a tall high school senior who loved sneakers and Star Trek t-shirts. He was by all accounts a giant dork. Neither me nor Rafa had ever given him much attention, even if we were neighbors. But after the attacks, we started hanging out. He was good for scoring an ounce on short notice. So one thing led to another, and before long, he was part of the crew. We'd even take him to vandalize things. And boy, was he a menace to society. One time, while sitting in a drive-thru at McDonald's and waiting for our food, he jumped the fence into the playground and under the cover of night, ripped the Ronald McDonald statue out from the ground. How he didn't get caught, how any of us didn't, I have no clue. Because next thing I knew, food in hand, we pulled up by the playground and there was Sohail, popping the trunk and loading Ronald into the back of Rafa's Ford Bronco. It was such an excellent night. Cruising around town, jamming with McDonald himself in the back. But when the party was over, we had to say goodbye. We drove to the top of the Rickenbacker Causeway, a tall bridge that arches over Key Biscayne, and we threw it off and into the current and watched it bob and drift out into the dark. That's how things were when Sohail would join us. He didn't just want to destroy mailboxes, he wanted to set them on fire. And he didn't care much for the small decorative fountains that people kept out in their yards. He was more interested in the large and extravagant public ones. In fact, it was Sohail who in November toppled the Coconut Grove Mall fountain at the peak of dinner time, and narrowly escaped as the community's heightened security descended on him. Just to be an asshole, he did it shirtless, wearing a black turban and yelling, "Yeah, yeah, 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 yeah." The guy even made the news. Muslim terrorist targets fountain in Coconut Grove. It was legendary. And we all had a good laugh, so understandably, we were saddened when Sohail stopped hanging out with us. Dude wouldn't even pick up the phone. Turned out his parents had found his stash. By the time the holidays were upon us, he was so grounded, he couldn't even look out his window when we'd tap. By then, most of Miami had unboxed their Christmas decorations. All of the city shimmered at night. It was merriment galore. So many lights, so many inflatables and nativities and you name it. It was enough to make us forget about flunking out and dead-end jobs and all the injustices we'd witnessed in college. We suspected that's what the decorations were for, to hide all the ugly of the world and help us stay distracted. How badly the country wanted to move on. The sentiment was everywhere. The media insisted that we not let the terrorists kill Christmas too. Politicians proclaimed, "Be brave, go shopping, your country needs you." Even with the White House closed to the public, Laura Bush hauled in Christmas trees and continued the tradition with the theme, "Home for the Holidays." There were stories of generous men, one who even traveled from Missouri to New York City with a wad of Benjamins, giving out one to anyone who looked needy. And these stories worked. We forgot about the fear, the vulnerability. We were too merry to pay attention as security measures increased, or to see George W. escalating tensions with Iraq. None of that mattered to us. The only thing we mourned was that Sohail was grounded, and we were without weed, and we didn't know what to do. We were bored. Everywhere we looked, there were decorations, too joyous and beautiful to smash, until one day there was only Christmas nonsense on the radio, and we were jamming to Last Christmas for like the 5th time, and I said, "Rafa, bro, pull over." So he did, and I walked right through someone's winter wonderland of a yard, right up to Plastic Santa, the same rosy-nosed kind my parents had when I was a kid, and I punched it in the face, my knuckles crushing through into the hollow, illuminated space. It was glorious. My fist was bleeding, and Rafa was laughing and hollering, and looking around at the strings of lights, the inflatable snowmen, and the rows of candy canes. I knew what we'd do next. We'd turn our attention from fountains to smashing Santas. So we started out small, yanking Christmas lights off trees and rooftops. One night, we realized that we could redecorate people's homes so that it seemed all those decorations were having an orgy. It was utter bacchanalia, what we were after. We could have an illuminated deer humping the Virgin Mary, and we could have Santa humping the deer, and we could duct tape Jesus and his little pecker to Santa's face. The possibilities were endless. And at around the time that some shit-faced British dude hid an explosive in his shoe on a flight to Miami, we really hit our fucking stride. It was classic. Our favorite activity dubbed football practice, involved tackling the inflatables. It's super fun. Just find the neighborhood that's Christmas heavy, you know, and you just park at one end, then you walk over to the other end. This works best when it's just you and a friend because you can race and you can keep a tally of how many figures you've tackled. Rafa and I would line up each on different sides of the street, then we'd count to 3 and begin the mayhem, diving into every inflatable character along the way, grabbing Santas and body slamming them, or jumping right into Mickey's faces. Even if these are sacs of air, the activity could be a bit iffy, because most of these inflatables are actually anchored to the ground. When you tackle them, the anchors come loose and they could gouge the living shit out of you. It happened to me. Luckily, only nicked me, but got my jeans good. I dragged Mickey half a block. The fucker wouldn't let loose. When I jumped in the truck, I took him with me. Like anything though, eventually the thrill of Christmas fashion grew dim, and we began to eye larger targets. We spent a weekend visiting local dealerships at night and slashing their mega giant inflatables, the kind you could see blocks away. Those were so dense with air that when we try and tackle them, we just bounce right off. That's why we use my steak knife. My favorite thing, when the big ones start to come down, it looks like they're gonna crush you. They just buckle over and descend upon you from like 20 feet in the air. And there's no thrill like running wildly with all that hot air blowing up dust and dirt. Did it make me a little sad? Sure. I'd been a kid once. I knew what it meant to pass one of those mega inflatables on the highway, parents bickering, a little hope and Christmas cheer looming over the whole stretch of the city, but fuck it. In our headspace, we needed it. Hell, given the chance, I'm not sure we'd have balked at hitting one of the towers ourselves. Maybe we would have destroyed Christmas that season for everyone in Miami. But one night, on a routine job rearranging someone's yard, cops showed up. They rolled into the neighborhood, real slow-like, lights off, and we didn't even see them until they were up close. It was Rafa, in fact, who shouted, "Pigs!" Lucky for us, we'd become cautious and we'd parked on another block. So by the time the police lights blasted on, we'd already dipped over a few yards into our getaway and we'd fled. But that next morning, we were heated. All the news channels took a break with the Muslim extremist bullshit to cover our Christmas bashing. It was a big news story. Reporters had descended on all of Miami, interviewing people, collecting surveillance tapes. The police even put out a reward for anyone with more information that could lead to an arrest. Suffice it to say, we were in deep shit. And rather than venturing out each night to kill the town, we'd gather around the TV at Rafa's place and watch the news. Seeing kids sob and tell their stories about ruined Christmases made us a little sad, of course, but we also loved the attention. We loved the feeling of having done something in secret, of having gotten away with it. Sometimes the news stations would play grainy videos of us in action, and it was glorious. It was like reliving the Christmas passion. And there was something else that was happening. Our violence was bringing the community together. Neighbors were chipping in and replacing each other's broken Christmas decorations. Look, I told Rafa, it's like we're the spirit of Christmas. But the attention scared us plenty, so we stopped, kind of. The last time we fought Christmas was at the start of the spring semester. Anyone with decorations still out, we'd reasoned, deserved a bit of ultra vandalism. I'm not sure what got us back into smashing Santas. I remember we were watching W's State of the Union address, and he'd said something about an axis of evil, and Rafa had said, "You know what would be an axis of good?" Since I'd known Rafa my whole life, I knew what the answer was. Tell me Christmas bash. I know what you're thinking. How could we outdo ourselves? What was there beyond football practice and the toppling of mega inflatables at the dealership? In truth, not much, but there was something unresolved. It was more of a joke. Certainly not something that would draw attention. I still remember when the seed of this idea came to me. We were circling our own block, sharing a joint, and I'd said, isn't it strange that his house is the only one on our block not decorated? So Hale? Yeah, I said. Everyone around here decorates like mad. Rafa laughed, yeah man, fucking Christmas Central, bro. Know what? We should decorate his place. Just imagine how he'd react. Bro, Rafa said, driving right past it, blunt in hand. Yes! But you really want to eat where you shit? We'd never done nothing like this in our own block. I don't know. What do you think? I think he'd love it. I think it'd make his grounding more enjoyable, I said. But then I second-guessed myself. We were wanted, after all, and I told Rafa that we should definitely hold off, even if we missed the dude. Still, it didn't stop us from joking about it. It should have stayed a joke. So when we did venture back onto the vandalism circuit on January 29th, we were in good spirits. We thought of ourselves as custodians of the city, picking up the mess left over by Christmas. We plucked some of those lighted deer from the Biltmore Hotel, only the best for Sohail. Then we swung by the Church of the Little Flower, which had this super nice life-size nativity. It was all a bit much to take, but we managed to pluck out the whitest little baby Jesus, Mary and Joseph. On the way back to our block, we stopped here and there, gathering strings of lights and inflatables. Then near Coral Park, we saw the coolest thing, a pink flamingo figurine with a Santa hat all lit up. And it wasn't the cheap plastic variety of it. This was a woodcut, beautifully crafted, smooth to the touch. So we ripped that bad boy out, slid it over the rest of our booty, and feeling good, went to Sohail's place. It must have been 3 in the morning. This time of night, our block was dead. We parked under a tree in the little shade, blocking the moonlight, and feeling quite comfortable and at home, we set out to decorate Sohail's place the best we could. We envisioned the Christmas palace, the kind of house that all the people of the greater South Florida would pilgrimage to just to see. What a shame that Sohail's family didn't decorate. Their yard was perfect for it. Lots of grass, just a few palms. We found the perfect place for the nativity, in a bed of white and pink petunias surrounded by mulch. Since we hadn't been able to fit the cow and sheep and the donkey in the truck, we situated the deer around the nativity, and the pink flamingo too as witness to the birth of Christ. All along the walkway we anchored down inflatables of every variety, but we held off on plugging them in because we didn't want to draw attention to ourselves. We worked silently, wrapping lights around palm trees and attaching all these cords together with the extension cords we'd swiped. Before we plugged it all in, Rafa and I stood there, proud of the work we'd done. We bumped fists. And he said something like, we've been breaking things so long I forgot what making something felt like. He was right. I took the end of the electrical cord, the master cord that we had managed to attach everything to, and I walked it over to the side of the house where I knew there was an outdoor outlet. I plugged it in, and Jesus, it was gorgeous. The fans and the inflatables whirred, and the bags of air stirred and rose. That's when I noticed the pigs. Fucking devils. They'd been smart this time. They'd likely parked further down the street to avoid detection. All that time, we'd been decorating, and little did we know that there were 4 officers closing in on us. Rafa was standing right in front of the doorway, really relishing all of it. It was the most joy I'd ever seen on his face. But I needed to warn him that we were busted, and I didn't know what to do. If I ran out toward him and yelled, it would reveal my position, and I'd get busted too. If I fled, then I'd feel guilty for letting him take the blame. And as I breathed and tried to control my heart rate and thought through what course of action I should take, I heard the front door to Soheil's house open, and I saw the shadow of a man cross over Rafa. It was Soheil's father, and he was holding a gun, a fucking real-life gun. Soheil's dad must have been scared, especially with all that anti-Muslim shit the media was spewing. And maybe building a nativity in a Muslim man's house was a tad insensitive. Couldn't he see, though, how funny it was? Couldn't he see how much such a prank would make his son laugh? I don't know how else to make sense of it, because next thing I knew, the pigs drew their weapons, one stepped into the light, and shouted, "Put that down right now." Soheil's father, barefoot, shirtless, and only in his plaid boxer shorts, was trembling. He knew what I didn't know then. It took Trayvon Martin, Marquise McLaughlin, and Jordan Davis, and all the other casualties for me to know why Soheil's father looked like he could piss his pants. So when he eventually did put his weapon down and motioned as if to say something, an officer tased him unconscious. And Rafa, who was already on his knees, hands behind his head, gave me a look as if to say, just run, man. No use in us both going down. But where could I run to? I saw Soheil step into the yard, sporting his Star Trek pajamas. The guy was utterly dazed by the lights and the cops and the whole of it. He collapsed on his father and sobbed. And I saw another cop draw his weapon, so I hid behind the AC unit. And I waited all night because I was scared. I waited for the police and the ambulance to leave, and when all was clear, when Rafa had been taken into custody, his truck impounded, I walked home, showered, and then drove to campus to measure mollusks and their fucking assholes. Thank you. So I would say, my wife told me don't publish that one. As a preface.
James, you found a better last line than this one. So.
I know, you're right. We were reading this young adult novel, This One Summer. You know that?
No, I don't.
The last line of it is,
If
boobs would be cool.
Yeah.
But that's a much better last line.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Hey, happy to talk about it if anybody has questions or anything.
I mean, I would ask
Oh, yeah.
you, like, could you tell us a little bit about the sort of the genesis of that
Sure.
story?
Yeah.
I mean, I could elaborate, but if you're ready for that, go for it.
Yeah, well, we'll begin there. The genesis, this came out of COVID, right? Like in COVID, I remember there was this moment where it was this weird moment where I was like getting home from the groceries, and like from the grocery store and taking the eggs and like wiping down each of them. I didn't know if we were gonna die, right? Like it was a scary moment, and we were all remote. Everybody that semester was just a mess, and I remember I was just home with my wife and daughter, and we were sitting there watching all of Star Wars, right, in order, in the order they came out. In the order
The year they came out.
Yeah, in the order they came. No, in the order, yeah. And I remember thinking, this is terrifying, but God, I'm so glad I'm with them right now, and like God, I'm so glad I get a break from all the other shit that's been going on. And at the same time, I knew it was complicated, but it reminded me a little bit of 9/11 because there was a similar vibe. And at the time, I had no interest in writing at all. Anything adjacent to 9/11, it just seemed really charged and complicated. But I definitely didn't want to write about COVID. I still don't want to write about it. It'll take some time. But that was the genesis. So it began there, and then usually what I do when I write a story is I sit down and I write the whole thing in one draft. So like a swing of the bat, right? So I drafted the entire thing, and it was that line. What is it? Something along the lines of we were just so relieved the world could end, right? That really caught steam. So it was that I had just read Benjamin Percy's. What is it? What's it called? That story that always gets anthologized.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Begins with an R.
Repeat. Yeah. I just read that. I was like, I like that energy that story has. And then, when you follow people on Facebook, you get to reconnect with some of your old college friends and stuff, and seeing some of their faces, like, I remember you. Right? I remember that. All of those things kind of came together. So that's the genesis of it.
Yeah. That last part of that answer made it sound like maybe there's an element of autobiography at play.
I remember. I'll say that. Living in Miami was fun, and there were some things that went down. I remember it's almost unbelievable, right? Where some of my friends would get together and be like, "What did you just do?" Right? And that extends through, 9/11, the subprime mortgage crisis. There was something about being down there and having friendships where everybody just got involved in something really diabolical. I don't know how else to put it. One of my closest friends was indicted by the FBI for his involvement in a subprime mortgage in a Ponzi scheme. There were all kinds of these weird things, right, that happened. So different world.
Yeah.
I don't know. Roundabout answer, but
No, part of the energy of that reminded me of Bartholomew's The School, how it just
Oh,
like
yeah,
escalates and escalates and escalates again. And it had that similar energy of like, where is this going? And then like, where are you going? And you say it explicitly, like, how are we going to top the mega inflatable? Like, what happens next? That's such a fun energy to build in a story. It's just lovely. This isn't a question. I'm just saying it's great. And I love it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a scary story to read aloud.
Yeah.
So I appreciate it.
I think it would be a fun story to read.
It's fun, but it's charged, right? There's
It's
a lot
charged,
there's a lot in there, and there's a very in today's talk, right? We spent a little bit of time talking about unreliable narration and the distance between. And so in some ways, that was preparation for this story. So.
I was wondering if if you could maybe just talk a little bit about the novel that's coming out
Sure.
in October. I mean, just as it's interesting to read the stories and then having read an early draft of the novel and like this world kind of that you're creating. That's like, I don't know. It all feels like it's part of the same universe in some ways. And I was wondering how, if at all, writing these stories, I guess, maybe taught you how to write the novel?
They're so different, right?
They're so different.
The novel was actually a story first.
Yeah.
And it was too big of a story. It was too much. And it felt rushed in ways that made me uncomfortable, so I just kind of put it away.
Could you recap like what the novel is about?
Oh, yeah,
Just
yeah.
real quick.
So the novel, it's called The Haunting in Hialeah Gardens. And it's set in Miami. It's Hialeah Gardens is kind of, well, I'll put it this way. When I say that it's set in Miami, I'm referring to Miami-Dade County, which has about 27 different cities and unincorporated districts and things, right? And like actual Miami is really just a tiny, tiny little city, right, close to downtown. There's so many little cities in Miami. One of the I guess, popular ones because of when a lot of Cubans came to Miami, a lot moved to Hialeah, right? So there are kind of, there's a lot of good energy around Hialeah. There are also kind of jokes about Hialeah, how when you go there, there's a lot of traffic and mud and rain and that kind of thing. And I liked the idea, I named the novel Haunting in Hialeah Gardens because I feel like Hialeah Gardens is trying to say I'm the fancy Hialeah, right? Like I'm just off to the left a little bit. It's not quite Hialeah, it's a little fancier than that. And it's a place people really don't write about a lot. I don't think there's anything written about Hialeah Gardens. It's a cool place because it's so far removed from Miami Beach and all of the kind of popular things you imagine when you think about Miami. And it's actually closer to the dump and all the industrial facilities that actually, like where they pour the concrete and cast it, and all the places where they actually like build the city, right? The infrastructure. So it's highly toxic and polluted, and then you've got like this land that's, you know, had all this industrial work done in it, and right next to it like these really fancy, high-value homes. And I was just fascinated by that, right? Like why have we developed that area? You know, like, why not just get closer to Miami Beach? Or I guess with rising sea levels, maybe that's not a good idea. I don't know. But essentially the story is, there's a man who's severely in debt. He has his wages garnished. There's a debt collector who calls him and tries to collect on more debt. Part of his debt belongs to his late wife, right? And the story opens up when he gets a call. It's Christmas time, and he gets a call from his debt collector, but he doesn't know it's him. He just sees a number, and he says, you know, should I answer the phone or should I just let it go to voicemail? And he goes, you know, I'm in a good mood. I'm going to answer the phone today. And he picks it up, and it's Alexi Ramirez, right, who's been like collecting on him for years. And you know, he doesn't like Alexi, so he says a lot of bad things. But then Alexi says, look, I need your help, right? My house is haunted. There's a ghost that lives in my house. And if you help me, I'll forgive all your debt. You won't owe me a penny, right? So Hugo, the protagonist, reluctantly agrees. But the complication is that even though he does do this professionally, he doesn't believe in ghosts. You know, it's all kind of just tricks, psychological tricks and things like that. And when he sets out to do the work, things start getting a lot more complicated, and another kind of devil emerges in the process, right? So that's kind of a rough idea. What's maybe a bit strange about the novel, considering the larger Miami literary landscape, is that it's narrated by a non-Cuban Latino. So it's narrated by a Bolivian American protagonist. In Miami, that's strange because there's such a, you know, Cubans essentially rule the city, right? And much of the literature of, you know, the strange Florida man stories and, you know, those kinds of things, right? You primarily see white male protagonists and Cuban protagonists. And in novels, especially rarely do you go elsewhere with exceptions, you know. Like Tana Riva Due, who's brilliant, was a Miami Herald journalist and also novelist, who wrote a lot about Miami, and then Edwidge Danticat, who moved to Miami and writes a lot about Miami. But then you've got films like Moonlight that are coming out, and everybody's like, damn, why don't we see more of this about Miami, right? And you know, and it's funny, right? You look at Miami's legacy, right? I mean, you look at Moonlight, you got to look at Miami Vice, and you got to look at them both next to each other. And it's interesting. So part of the project of the novel, and I'll stop after that, is just you know, who gets to tell the city's story, and how do we ensure that we can expand that a bit, you know? So long response. But
No, awesome.
So I could read more. Happy to. How much time do you think I got? 15? 15? Okay, I'll read a short little piece. This is more autobiographical. I'm just going to read an excerpt. It's from the final story in the collection. It is heavily influenced by my grandmother, who's still living, and who's I'm so grateful that she loves me and is on my side. So when I was a child, I didn't have an appetite. My grandmother had to be clever in order to feed me. She'd take me on lizard hunting expeditions in her backyard, this grove, to distract me. Every time I'd catch a lizard, she'd sneak a spoonful of rice into my mouth. Then she'd take the lizard from my hands, snap its neck, and toss it over the fence. Do we have to kill them? I'd say, my mouth full of rice. What, you feel bad for a lizard? Well, yeah. Well, don't be like your grandfather. Let's find another one. Eventually, we weren't so much concerned with brown and green on those. They were clumsy lizards, quick to defecate. Plus, they'd lose their tails when we catch them. It was the Cuban knights we searched for, the noble, vicious, the venomous lizard. We'd shake them off the trees. Then my grandmother would let me beat them with a broom until I'd broken their legs, or paralyzed them. When they could hardly move, she'd snap their necks and toss them over the fence also. Then she'd force a spoonful of rice into my mouth and say, "You'll need your strength for the next battle, Yamut." After I'd grown accustomed to eating rice, she tried to get me hooked on meat. So she'd mince flank steak and hide the bits under a plate of rice and diced mango. She'd feed me as we hunted for nights. But I'd sift the meat and the mango out with my tongue, and I'd form these giant, flavorless balls of meat and hide them between my teeth and cheek. She'd reach into my mouth and fling them over the hedges. "Here you are, throwing away perfectly good food," she'd say. "Meanwhile, Fidel Castro is drinking horse milk. It's getting closer to the secret of my powers, you know." "What powers?" And she'd interrupt me by shoving another spoonful into my mouth. That one month in the summer when the storms knock all the mangoes to the ground and the sun turns all that pulp into yellow jelly, so the whole yard is buzzing with horseflies, my grandmother and I would clean the yard, shoveling mangoes into a wheelbarrow. We'd push the wheelbarrow over to the hedges and spend the afternoon flinging them over. Occasionally, she'd cup a handful of jelly and try to shove it in my mouth. I'd have to bite her fingers to make her stop. Concerned I might spill over under heat stroke, she'd pour cups of ice water over my head. In retaliation, I'd hose her down. And by the end of the day, we'd be soaked and covered in mango, and she'd curse at my grandfather for all his plantium. "Your trees are going to be the death of me." When I was 11, my grandfather began raising birds for a living. He spoke bird. All it took was a few whistles and caws, and he'd have any bird eating mango out of his hand. He started out with lovebirds, but upgraded to lories. One Easter, he seduced a peacock into the yard and trapped it in his tool shed. Convinced that trapping a peacock was bad luck, my grandmother snuck into the tool shed with me. She handed me a broom, shoved me. "Why don't we let it go?" I asked. "Because if we let it go, he will whistle and hold out some mango and catch it again. He always catches them again. We can blindfold it and take it far away and release it in a nice place. It will never want to leave." "It will return," she said. "All birds end up here." She poked at the broom and asked, "Are you going to do it?" Before I could answer, she grabbed the peacock by its neck. The lories went nuts, cawing and beating their wings against the cages. I had to cover my ears to bear their high-pitched shrieks. They sounded like sirens. Their shrieks were ringing and digging into my skull, so I thought I might cry their cries. I was going to step out of the shed, but she slammed the door shut and looked at me. The curls of her hair were plastered against her face with sweat. She lifted that peacock over her head, then she twisted its neck as if it were dough. She was spinning the bird over her head, slamming it into the spades and shovels and pickaxes affixed to the ceiling. It rained red and green feathers. When she dropped the bird on the ground, it lay gray and limp, and she laughed. It was an embarrassing laugh. It was an embarrassed laugh. She'd gotten carried away and made a mess. And she knew it. Stuck to the blood-splotched shed walls were the peacock's feathers, which made it seem like we were being watched by 1,000 blue eyes. We spent the afternoon cleaning the shed, careful to remove all the feathers. She threw the peacock over the hedges. The following day, when my grandfather asked what had happened to the peacock, my grandmother shrugged and said, "It must have escaped." "Helga," he said, "leave my birds alone. Be quiet, old man." The red lories were known to attract pests, so my grandfather purchased a cat named Kitty. There was an open lanai, and sometimes Kitty would leave snakes or birds as offerings on the welcome mat by the screen door in exchange for a can of tuna. Occasionally, I'd poke Kitty's offerings with a stick, which my grandmother could not tolerate. She'd curse, "Coño, carajo," and fling the dead animals over the hedges. Then she'd beat Kitty with a broom, and my grandparents would argue about the proper way to treat animals. When Kitty vanished, it seemed natural then that everything should end up flung over the hedges at one point or another. Sometimes at dusk, I'd climb over the hedges, careful not to prick myself. And I'd play in the prairie. I'd pretend I was an archaeologist. looking for dinosaurs, and I'd dig up the bones of all the lizards and snakes we'd thrown over the hedges all those years. There were many. Kitty was there, and so was a peacock. Sometimes I'd poke at Kitty's bones, but I'd leave the bird bones alone. Something about the way birds decompose whirled about their feathers reminds me of angels. It was lonely on the other side of the hedges. How I wish there was someone to help me unearth all these bones. That's just a little extra. That's fine. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raul. All right. If you don't want to read that book, I don't know what's wrong with you. Amazing. Thank you so much for wrapping up our series so beautifully and troublingly. And I just wanted to give a special thanks and shout out to the people who have supported the series and shown up and helped make it feel alive and worth doing, because it's a lot of work, right? And I'm always thrilled to hear what the writers who we bring have been doing, but it's really, we're doing it for a larger group, and so for the people who are standbys here and later, thanks for coming, thanks for being a part of this, and that's it. Let's just give one more round of applause for writer Raul Palma.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, the Raul,
Wait, I
also donate that one.